Okay, so evolution of a man geek. I just like that image. It's probably not particularly relevant, but I like that. Okay, so gaming on Linux, we're going to be a little bit light on detail. We're going to be a little bit light on facts. We're going to be a little reliant on some already present YouTube videos because I had some issues recording footage, but we got it right in the end for the final slide. So here we go. So in the beginning, 8-bit, 16-bit and 13-bit, 32-bit computers, a lot of you may remember those. Some of you may be too young to remember the 8-bit and 16-bits. In the early days, there was DOS, there was Unix. Unix was generally thought of more as a business operating system. And for that reason, it didn't quite take off the same as the Microsoft-based operating systems did. And as games started to be developed, because where there was a computer, there was usually a desire to play some sort of game and not just use business applications. So Unix-based operating systems, and from this point on, I'll refer to them as Linux, were really late off the ground getting games running. There were some very early games such as NetHack and Civil War, Space Travel and XConk, I've listed them there, had been developed for the platform. But as early as 1994, the first AAA DOS title, DOS Windows game was ported, which was Doom. The older people amongst us may remember Doom. I'm hoping you can hear the sound as well as see the video on that. Anybody shout up if you can't?
Can't hear the audio.
Can't hear the audio. Is that working?
Oh, yeah, it's quiet.
I apologise, sorry.
It's quiet, just turn it all the way up.
Okay. Yes, so this is an example of an early DOS Windows game. Again, in this case, it is running on a Linux machine. But it was a very early 3D shooter, what's known as amongst gamers as a first-person shooter, as you're seeing the action from the first-person perspective. Most first-person shooters are really quite gory and full of graphic violence, and that was from the outset, and that's what the gamers like, and that's what they play. There's usually lots of weapons involved, lots of monsters or things to shoot and kill, things to pick up, as you can be seen in this video. And you usually get to the end of levels or the end of play, and you get rewarded in points and told how well you've done. So that's a very early game, and like I say, that was ported across from DOS and Windows in 1994 to Linux. Some other games were developed over the years, some of them that are still available even now. Games you may be familiar with, such as Tux Racer here. Other games would be like the Westnoth, which is a kind of a adventure come role-playing game. And they were very early, and for a long time they were almost as good a game as you could get on Linux, whilst at the same time games on Windows and DOS had really moved on. The graphics were by now far superior to what you're seeing in these games. The gameplay was much more involved. These games are really quite simplistic in their action. In Tux Racer, obviously racing downhill against the clock. You're trying to collect fish for the penguin. You're trying to make the best time possible. And in the Battle for Westnoth, you're trying to create characters, create a village, I believe. I played it once or twice, and unfortunately, it's not my kind of game. So unfortunately, it didn't get particularly much attention. So those were kind of amongst the early developed for Linux games, and you can still install those now from your repositories without an issue. As it says here, hopefully the dates and the years are correct. Wine was released around 1993, and as you're all aware, rather than it being an emulator, it's a compatibility layer that kind of tries to work between the Linux backend and the software front end, Windows software front end, to try and enable it to run. Even in the early days, some of the old DOS and Windows games would work right out of the box with Linux, particularly if they were the old DOS games. They used to work quite well with Wine. But again, the list of games that were available for gamers like myself was very, very, very limited. And usually to get a lot of games running took a lot of work, a lot of tweaking. In some cases, a lot of renaming of files, because as you know, Linux doesn't like or doesn't see a capital letter and a lowercase letter as the same letter, whereas Windows does. So where there may be calls within the code for certain files or DLLs and things, where Windows would handle that without an issue, Linux would fall over quite happily. So yes, that's always created a slight issue. So unfortunately, the best, if you wanted to play the better, more Windows developed games, it took a lot of messing about with Wine to try and get it to run successfully. And as you can see by the year, it took a long time for a piece of software to come along. 2007, Play on Linux, which offered a GUI for Wine and enabled you to actually install games, and it gave assistance for not just games, other software as well. And it would color match games and give you an idea of what would run well, what wouldn't run well. I will keep saying games, but it was relevant for other software as well. You can use it to install Microsoft Office if you're struggling getting Microsoft Office to install, as an example. But as I say, for the first time, there was actually a proper list of games that would run quite happily or with varying degrees of success under Linux. And slowly over time, that list did start to grow as a few more users started to use Linux as an operating system. Some software houses and some people started to put a little bit of time and effort into making games available for Linux. Some would question, is Wine bad? Is Wine good? It could be, as I've said here, it could be argued that Wine goes some way to preventing developers either writing or porting software to Linux. Why would they need to bother if it'll run in Wine? And then you could argue that it does help Linux users play games that software houses just wouldn't provide games to the Linux platform, simply because there's just not enough game players using Linux. There's not enough money in it for them. So Wine does enable certain items of software. As you can see here, this is Microsoft Office running under Linux. We've got Adobe Photoshop, maybe an earlier version of Adobe Photoshop, but still Photoshop running on the Linux platform, all using Wine. So the argument can go either way as to whether Wine is good or bad for Linux, and not only gaming, but other software as well. And then along came GOG and Steam. GOG stands for Good Old Games, and Steam provide a similar service, but generally for much more modern software. GOG are working their way through lots of back libraries and back editions, finding Windows and DOS games, and making sure that they will run not only on modern versions of Windows, but also that they'll run on Linux as well. And they do support a huge range of the software, the older games that they offer to run on Linux. So that's been quite a good service, but again, it tends to be the older games rather than the more modern ones. Steam, on the other hand, concentrate on mostly the latest software. They do have an awful large library. They have sales at various times through the year where you can buy modern AAA titles for not a lot of money, or if you're willing to pay a reasonable amount of money, you can buy them at any point you want. With both of these sites, you do require an account. You do require to have a payment method attached to it. Although both sites do offer free software, free games on occasions, or they'll have free-to-play weekends and things. But thankfully, what's happened here is that both of these companies have realized that actually there are Linux gamers out there who want to be able to play games. So they're slowly making it easier for Linux gamers and for people who want to use a Linux platform and still game. I myself, I've got a good mixture of Linux and Windows-based PCs. Most of the games I own are Windows games, but it's nice that I can actually start loading some of these games, particularly the older games, onto my Linux boxes and actually play them. So I was going to go for, I wasn't quite sure of the kind of crowd that were going to be watching this. So I thought I'd put together a few slides and just demonstrate the kinds of games. This is by far nowhere near a list of all the different types of games, but it is a few examples. It's a few examples of the kind of games I generally like to play, with the exception of platform games. There's a vast list of different types of games, whether they be simulations, as I've mentioned here, first-person shooters, you've got adventure games, strategy games, you've got board games, table games, you've got ghost adventure games, you've got, you think of some sort of genre that could be turned into a game, and it probably has been. I will give you a warning here that this is where some of the YouTube videos start that I've borrowed from YouTube, trimmed them down a little bit so that each section of each video is probably about a minute long, but some of them do contain a bit of violence. So if there's the weaker hearted or more frail amongst you, they may not want to watch them. You can always just close your eyes while the videos are going. But here we go. So simulations have been around for a very long time, really started coming into their own very early on, with even the 8-bit computers. Early 8-bit computers had tried to have things like flight simulators and car driving simulators, to varying degrees of success. Thankfully, as the power of gaming machines has progressed, the abilities of these games has improved. In this case, I've got 3 1-minute videos back to back. The first one's just demonstrating a car racing game running on Linux. In this case, it's some sort of time trial. You can hear the guy talking. I'll just let you watch and listen to the video. It's about 3 minutes long. So in this case, the guy will probably be, I can almost imagine the guy's probably sitting at his desk with a steering wheel and some pedals. And he's going to be sitting in his little armchair and he's racing his car around the track. And here we're moving on to a flight simulator. The thing with simulators is, just imagine that almost any anything can be turned into a simulation. If you can do it in real life, there's probably a game out there where they've already turned it into a game. Again, all of the game videos, bar one that you'll be watching this evening, is running on a Linux machine. Microsoft Flight Simulator's just been released that's actually using real maps and real data, real weather data and stuff to generate the world that you're flying around in. So it is potentially even possible now with the Microsoft Flight Simulator to fly over your own house and see your own house from the sky. Again, this is another simulator. This one is, John should be aware of this one. This is Elite Dangerous. This is a space simulator game that simulates space flight. In the game, you own a spaceship, and it's up to you to try and stay alive and to find a way of making a living and making life comfortable for yourself. In this case, the pilot's going to be trying to dock with a space station, which for those of you that may have played or remember the old original Elite was next to impossible, the old wireframe graphics. But nowadays, a game like this will run quite happily on sort of 2010 onwards hardware. It should run reasonably well. I've seen simulators for running a farm, for running a theme park. There's simulators for driving a truck or a tractor. There's even a game that's a simulator for building PCs, should you wish to partake in your virtual PC building skills. That would normally be the point in the old wireframe version that you would crash and die going through the letterbox in the space station. So in this case, the pilot or the game player is bringing his ship into land. Gravity and inertia is used in this game. As you can see, the thrusters are being used to position hold the ship while it's coming into land. You can turn this game has a thing called flight assist that you can turn off, so that you do suffer with full inertia during the game. First person shooters, really my favorite kind of game next to strategy games. Again, they tend to be very gory. You can play them, some games, third person as well as first person. But these tend to be quite gory, quite graphic, quite violent, and usually involve lots of weapons, lots of shooting, lots of killing of enemies in various gruesome and atrocious ways. But they do tend to be quite a lot of fun. I'm hoping you guys can hear the audio on the games as well.
It's very quiet.
That's unfortunately the maximum the volume will go up, so. There's a lot of competitive online play games like this one where the video footage is showing now. This is CSGO, or it actually stands for Counter-Strike Global Offensive, which you have a client running that's the game that connects into servers, and all these other moving people that you can see are other human players sitting at their desks, desperately trying to stay alive and not get killed. So it's pitting yourself and your gaming skills against other human players. And that's one of the aspects of this kind of game that I like, is pitting my skills against other players. Although this is not particularly a game I play, I will see later the game, one of the games that I play most often now. Again, this is pretty much all first-person action. You can see how quickly you die, you respawn, you get back into the fight. And the idea is just to try and get as many kills as you can whilst dying as few times as you can. You can see the persistence in the game where blood spatters stay blood splattered. This one might be a bit too loud. This particular game uses a bit more cartoony style graphics. This particular game is called Team Fortress. Again, similar thing to CSGO. It's you again. All the other players you see moving around are other human players sitting at their PCs, connecting into the server, and pitting their skills against each other. The action tends to be quite gory, but quite fast-paced. Platform games is another form of game that's actually been around for a very, very long time, because they don't particularly require much in the from the graphics perspective, right up to some games that are just the way they're executed and the kind of graphics you see are really kind of stunning. But they tend to be side or vertical scrollers, or a combination of vertical and side, and some are even in 3D. We'll start off with quite a simple platform game. I may just push this one forward a little, but you're playing a little character who gets to travel around this almost Mario-looking world, and again, this is a game available on Steam for Linux. In fact, all of the games I've shown you are available on Steam for Linux. So this character gets an invite, and now he has to go and try and almost parkour his way around the map using platforms and ladders. Usually you have to, in platform games, you have to try to avoid certain things on the map, things that may kill you, or if you fall a long distance, you may have to start again, or your character may die. They can be cutesy like that, or in this particular case, you play the part of a deadly alien. The basic idea of the game is still the same. It may graphically look different, but again, as you can still see, you're still just moving around platforms on a map, encountering doors and obstacles and things that get in your way that you maybe have to avoid, or maybe have to collect. In this case, I believe the monster feeds on the humans it finds, and as it feeds, it gets bigger and more powerful. Again, quite a gory game, but again, gamers tend to like things like that. The monster seems to spend most of his time killing humans. And as you can see, as he's killing them, he's getting bigger and bigger. I don't know what happens when he gets too big. Onto a game like this, which is very much more an indie game, very much more, it's very pretty. The graphics in the game are stunning. It looks very different to the last two we've seen, but as you'll see in a little bit, it's telling a bit more of a story, but it is also still, at its heart, a platform game, where the primary character, which is the little white creature, has to move around the screen, various platforms, encounter and avoid different things within its world. And this is very much more a modern title than the others we've seen. Adventure and role-playing games, yet another. Adventure games are again one of the oldest game types for computers, particularly Unix and DOS-based systems, because a lot of the very early games were text-based games. So you'd be typing in commands like walk north, attack monster. But they moved on, and adventure games became more reliant on graphics, both adventure and role-playing games. You can kind of link them into the same genre, because both in adventure games and in role-playing games, you are playing a character. Usually there's some sort of storyline attached, and you're trying to make your way through a world, trying to stay alive. In this particular game is from Skyrim. For those who are familiar, Skyrim's a Windows game, and as you heard the guy saying, this is running on his Linux PC. But generally, there's lots of story attached, lots of going from place to place, lots of land to wander over in the more modern games, lots of things to discover, lots of powers to increase your skills in magic or weapon skills. And they tend to be very long games in relation to, say, something like a first-person shooter, where you could class a first-person shooter really as pretty much a casual game. You can drop in a match, drop out of a match. You might play for half an hour. Whereas adventure and role-playing games, they tend to be more long-winded, and you have to invest a lot more time and a lot more energy into playing the games and evolving characters. And some role-playing and adventure games can literally go on for weeks and months, and some never end. So some are really quite good. But in my opinion, the best games tend to be the mixed genre games, where they take two or more of the main genres of games and mix them and combine them into a single game. So a game like a first-person shooter, but one where you have to find stuff to keep yourself alive. You're pitting yourself against other people. You're going on a bit of a wander through a land in order to find the things you need to stay alive and to equip yourself and to move yourself along. In this particular game, this is DayZ, and this is the one game in this presentation that actually, as far as I'm aware, currently doesn't run in Linux. The irony is you can actually run a DayZ server in Linux, but you can't play the game. And the reason for that is because DayZ, along with lots of modern titles, use a form of digital rights management to control the platforms they're played on, and to make sure that people aren't playing them in ways and means that they shouldn't be doing, which is one of the things that Steam is still trying to find ways around, so that games can be run. But as you can see, this character's playing in first person. He's trying to find items. That's the map that he's playing on. It's actually a map of a real part of the world, subverted for game use. But the actual game map is a persistent map, and it's about 144 square kilometers. So it is actually a vast map and a vast land to move around in. As you can see here, he's seen another player. So in typical DayZ style, you take them down, because if you don't take them down, the chances are they're probably going to turn around and take you down. Again, you can see he's leveling up with items. He's pinching off the guy he's just killed. A lot of games like this have an inventory system that you have to maintain as well, and make sure you're carrying enough food and enough weapons and enough medical supplies to stay alive. Very hard game. I guarantee if you start playing DayZ standalone, for the first week, you probably won't make it out of your spawn town alive. Anywho, moving on. Proton is one of the newest things in town, released by Steam in 2018. Proton pulls together various technologies that enable Windows games, more modern Windows games, to run on Linux. And it's been very successful so far, and they're forever adding to the list of compatible games. It pulls together things like technologies such as Wines, technologies such as DirectX, certain snippets of DirectX 11, 10 and 11, to enable games to run, various other bits and bobs of technology. It's still very much quite young in the game from gaming terms, but it is making quite a splash on the Linux gaming scene, because it is finally allowing people to play Windows games almost natively on a Linux platform. So this is definitely a thing to watch if you're a gamer. Hopefully things are going to really now start to improve, and hopefully we'll start seeing more, hopefully, development of stuff that will run quite happily, and maybe a little less use of digital rights management. You can download Steam from its own website. You can install it using your own command line and your preferred packet or your preferred package manager. In my case, my Linux gaming machine is using Mint, and I do use the Synaptic package manager because, as I said before, I think Linux users tend to like to make life hard for themselves just because there's kind of, on some levels, some form of masochism going on. I like to make things simple for myself, so I'm quite happy to use the Synaptic package manager. What you will need if you're going to install games on Linux from Steam or even GOG is you will need to create an account. You will need to create a payment method. In my case, I use PayPal, and I have my PayPal linked to both my GOG and my Steam account, so that should I buy a game, the money just comes directly out of my account. But what I'm going to be doing now is the next video, I suspect the audio is going to be too quiet for most of you to hear, so I may have to talk over the video. But the next video is going to be showing me, I'm going to be installing the Steam client on my Linux Mint PC, and then I'm going to be installing a Windows game on the PC, and we'll show you a couple of seconds of the game running. The reason I didn't show more than a couple of seconds of the game running is purely wifey had phoned me and told me my tea was ready, so I had to come back down out the garage. So here we go. Again, I apologise if it's too quiet. I will try and talk over the top, but here we go. So if you can't hear that, what I'm doing is I'm now starting up the Synaptic package manager. I'm going to be looking for and downloading the Steam client. So I'm looking for the Steam installer there. I'm going to install that. It's got it's got a few dependencies, but in this case they were already mostly on my system. It's just going to install a couple of new packages. As you can see, that didn't take an awful long time. Lucky enough to have a reasonable internet connection here, so now we're running the Steam client for the first time. There you go, cheating. So now, because I've already got an account, I can just put my credentials in and get logged in, and that should then make, I've actually got two accounts. The more astute amongst you will notice that at some point through the video, the account changes from Digbert's dad to Digbert. They're both my accounts. One's used for I've got a bad character in a game, and I've got a good character in the same game, so I keep the two accounts separate. So this is the Steam interface. It's got a library, a store. The library is the list of games that you've already purchased, the things that you can install. You can see that they do have a menu system, and part of that is games for Steam OS and Linux. Steam OS is a Linux-based operating system actually released by Steam that you can install on a PC, and it will act as a direct interface both to their store and any games you install through it. I've been told will run quite happily. I've yet to install it. This is a 2.2 gig game I'm downloading here, but it is a Windows native game. It takes about 4 minutes on my connection to download 2.5 gig. So that's it. That's a Windows game downloaded and installed on my Linux Mint desktop. There's the good old Valve head. Portal's actually quite an interesting game. Got Portal and Portal 2. You play the part of a character that gets given a gun that can create a portal that you can pass through. And eventually you get given the gun gets upgraded to the point where you can create a portal that you come in by and leave by. So you can have an entry and an exit portal. And it's essentially a 3-dimensional platform game that you have, a platform puzzle game that you have to work your way through. There's no killing of other people involved, no blood, guts and gore. It's just purely a platform game. That's actually quite a lot of fun, and you can usually get for £4 or £5 on Steam, and it's quite a lot of fun to play. And that's it. That's the installation of the Steam client. Literally, given the fact I subtracted 4 minutes of download time, that literally is as fast as it can happen. For the game and for the install in the client. So as you can see, it's quite an easy process. So I just thought I'd put together a few notes at the end on what I think is the problem with Linux gaming, because it is my firm belief that it's gaming that caused PCs to take off the way they did, particularly the DOS Windows environments. The more games became available for it, the easier it was to go to your parents and say, look, instead of buying me a games console, can I just have a PC, and then I can do my homework, and under your breath say I can play a few games as well while I'm at it. And it's part of the problem with Linux is the lack of interest due to low platform take-up, because there's so few gamers out there. Because there's so few games out there for directly playable in Linux until more recently, there just hasn't been the take-up in the gaming circles. There's so many games out there for Windows and games consoles. Hardware drivers is also another issue. The drivers for Linux-based operating systems, particularly for graphics cards, tends to lag behind the development of drivers for the other platforms, and that hinders games development also. If you're playing on older, less optimized drivers for things like video cards, you tend to get lower frame rates. You might get choppy screen displays, and if you're if you're in a, say, a first-person shooter, for example, and you're playing against somebody who's on a Windows machine and they've got nice, smooth display, but your screen keeps dropping frames and glitching occasionally, or pausing or stalling, you're all automatically already playing at a loss, and that's a real hindrance from a gamer's perspective. In addition to that, Linux gamers, we don't want to be buying games twice, and very often what you have to do, which is one of the reasons another reason I have 2 Steam accounts, is that in order to own both, where there is a Windows and a Linux version of a game, I don't want to have to buy the game twice, and in some cases you have to. If you want the Linux version, you have to buy it, which is just a real shame. If you own the license for one, I don't understand. Well, I do understand, but I'm just playing devil's advocate, that why would I have to pay for the license twice just to be able to play it on a different platform? I just find that a little unfair. But then you could also say at the same time argue that, well, people who play the game on an Xbox would also have to pay to buy it again to play it on Windows. So you can see both sides of the argument. In addition, the games that are available for Linux that have been ported or that will run do generally tend to be the older titles. Portal that I showed you there is probably one of the oldest games I actually own. But the reason I chose to install that was A, it was quite a small download, and B, I just knew it worked because I actually run it on an old Core i3 laptop that I've got, and it runs quite happily on Linux. But as I mentioned during the presentation, that even with current technology, digital rights management is a real problem for people who want to game on the Linux platform, because the people that create these digital rights control applications don't create them for Linux. They only create them for Windows. So even trying to run those applications through Wine and through Proton, they fall over because the digital rights mechanism notices the fact it's not running on a Windows platform. Therefore, the game doesn't run. And that's a real problem. And it's about trying to get games manufacturers, games developers to basically either stop using the DRM or to make it so that it still enables games to run in Linux. It's problematic, and it's one the industry, particularly Steam, are definitely working hard with the developers to try and get around and to try and find ways to enable Windows games to run more happily on a Linux platform. Okay, that's the end of the tedium. Is anybody still awake?
Yep.
Thanks
Brilliant.
very much.
Yep.
Any questions?
No questions as such, but Mick, thanks for doing that. I'm not a great game player, I've got to admit, but I have been watching and following the Linux gaming sort of like scene for a few years now, and I have to admit, you know, the quality of gaming now that's available on Linux, and I think Steam did probably make a big inroads into that, is amazing. I remember those very early sort of like Linux games. They were blocky and sort of like very low quality graphics, like you described. But now you get some stuff. It's so realistic. It's competing exactly with the you know, the Windows based software.
Yes,
So,
absolutely.
yeah, it is absolutely amazing. As I say, I'm not really much of a gamer, but you know, I think it's great to see what you know. Thanks for the chat, and it's just good to see it's going that way.
Yeah, I certainly hope so. I think it's the one thing that has held take up of Linux back, because if you can go to somebody and say, I can build you a gaming PC, stick Linux on it, save you £100 that you can say instead of Windows that you can spend on a better graphics card. Here's your games, and here you go. It would be so much so much of an easier sell than saying, well, you can game on Linux, but you're going to have to jump through hoops, eat your lunch while you're standing on your head, and if you're really lucky, you might just get off a screenshot before the game crashes. And I think until we resolve some of these issues as Linux users and stuff, that Linux is always going to drag behind because the developers are not interested, because they want to develop games for where their main market share is, which tends to be Windows.
Yeah, and I think some of it actually was to do with just the graphics drivers, wasn't it? Because
Yes, that's one of the biggest problems.
Yeah, and that was the big issue. If you remember, Riley, for about quite a few years, the graphics drivers were just not there for Linux. That's now changed quite a lot in the last 2 years, I think, actually. That's opened up the gaming market definitely for Linux.
Yes, definitely. It's definitely getting better from a gamer's perspective, particularly since Proton. And there's another thing that I haven't mentioned called Lutris, which is a tool for Linux that you can link your Steam account, your GOG account, and various other accounts too for other gaming companies. And you can, as long as you own a game, you can click a button and it will go away and install everything you need to try and get that game running successfully. I haven't looked too much into Lutris yet, but that was going to be, if there is ever a Mark II version of this presentation, it would include something to do with Lutris, I think, as well.
I was just going to ask, what do you think of Microsoft's purchasing of Bethesda? And do you think that's going to affect Linux gaming?
Yes, I suspect it's going to be quite harmful if it's allowed to run the usual course of anything that Microsoft buys. I don't know. I'm a bit worried about that. Bethesda's quite a big developer. They develop some very well-known games. I believe they're responsible for things like the Fallout series and stuff, if my memory serves. And I just worry about what Microsoft are doing and why. What's in it for them, and are they going to kill off any Linux development? Because effectively, if the development studios are developing software to run on Linux, they're potentially developing it to run on a system that's a competitor to Windows, and I can't imagine Microsoft are going to be keen on that. So I don't know.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, I think it's quite concerning. I think they could. Well, Microsoft behaves like Microsoft has behaved, like you said. You think they're going to try and shut it out, really, aren't they?
Yeah, I think they're. Yeah, I think they can be quite aggressive in shutting down things that they see as competitors. They do have a history of buying them and then they disappear. They've done that with lots of things over the years. Similar to Apple. Apple are no better. So, yeah. Don't know. To concern is my short answer.
Much difference these days between NVIDIA Radeon and graphics cards in terms of plug and play? Are they still a bit of a pain to get sorted out?
The plug and play, from the plug and play perspective, is certainly NVIDIA, I believe, are very good with their drivers now. They do make drivers available for Linux for their cards. AMD and Radeon, they tend to lag behind. Their drivers tend to take a bit longer to mature on Linux. If they even bother to release them, you tend to find yourself using drivers for one card that are for another. And but for the most part, yes, graphics drivers are now in Linux pretty much plug and play. The only difference is how well optimized they are compared to their Windows equivalents. Right. I've seen the same game running on Linux and Windows, and it would have been a time where the frame rate, the frames per second, once upon a time would have been literally half on Linux compared to what they were on the Windows platform. And obviously with frame rates, the higher the frame rate, the better, usually, as gamers would argue. But more recently, we have seen there have been occasions where there are, on some games, you can actually achieve higher frame rates in Linux than you can in Windows. and that's been demonstrated even by, if anybody watches the Linux Tech Tips, they put a video out not so long ago where they were comparing side-by-side gaming on Windows and gaming on Linux. And actually, a couple of the games they tested ran better on the Linux platform using Proton than they did natively on their own platform of Windows. So it swings and roundabouts. There's good aspects and there's bad aspects. Unfortunately, where it's bad, it's really quite bad. Right. So
I think the graphics have changed a lot on Linux because people are using it for video rendering and all sorts of stuff now. And
absolutely, yes.
NVIDIA jumped into that market and have always had Linux drivers. And of course now with things like CUDA for computer processing as well and AI stuff, yes, the NVIDIA drivers have heavily been developed.
Yes, because
it's now a lot more active. It's now a lot more active on this platform because it's used for other parts of their business.
Yes, NVIDIA have been really quite the trendsetter as far as producing drivers for Linux, and AMD have been kind of playing catch up. I think they're slowly getting there. I think they're slowly getting an understanding that actually there are Linux users out there who want to get the full benefits of their new hardware, and so they are trying. They're very trying mostly. Any other questions? Is anybody going to go out and try some Linux gaming?
I certainly will be, Mick.
Thank you, John.
I've actually had. What was I running? I was running Factorio on a laptop.
Yes. Yes, I've actually put that on my wish list, but nobody's bought it me yet, Lee.
Weirdly, whilst I was going up the M6, sitting as a passenger in the car.
Yes, it wouldn't be the first time I've done that. I have actually played Portal that you saw me install on my little Linux i3 laptop whilst we were travelling up to John O'Groats last year when we drove up there for a holiday. Wifey was driving and I was playing Portal. So, yeah, that went down well.
I was going to say getting bonus points for navigation and things there.
Oh no, you have a sat nav for navigation. You don't rely on me for navigation. The only map I have no issues with is the Chernerus map, which you play on in DayZ.
I've got I've got Steam downloaded already, and I literally done it a couple of days ago. But just for literally CS:GO, that's the only game I knew was on Steam, and then I was like, okay, right, I need to get that. But definitely, I didn't realise that there were so many now games that were Windows games that you could actually play because of the Proton thing. So I need to have a look at that website and see what games are.
And what you can do is that because they've released quite a few different versions of Proton, and within the Steam client, you can actually, if you're having issues running a game on the latest Proton you can pick earlier versions and you can pick different start modes. And things. So where a game might run very well on Proton 2 versions ago, it might not run so well today. But you can have multiple versions of Proton installed or selected, and so if a game doesn't run well on one, you might want to try a different version, because sometimes just switching the version of Proton will help.
All right, that's definitely have to go. What other kind of, because I'm more of a first-person shooter, what other games would you say should be my next on the list then on Steam for Linux?
As you saw there, those 3 games. I had CS:GO, Team Fortress, and I can't remember what the other one was. They were all running on Linux. Let me just go back to see what that slide was. Yeah, that was Call of Duty, CS:GO, and Team Fortress. All 3 of those were running on Linux.
Oh no! I used to have an Xbox 360. I was a massive Call of Duty fan back, so I'll be definitely looking that up then. Brilliant.
Again, I've not played either of those. I've played CS:GO, but not the other two, so
Yeah,
I can't state how easy they may or may not be to install.
it's worth a
I'm
try.
very much a DayZ player, really, both the Arma 2 version and the standalone version. That they're very much right up my street, because it's not only a first-person shooter, but it's also a trying to stay alive simulator, really, or as some would call it, a running simulator, because you spend most of your time running places, trying to get away, or trying to get to somebody who's shooting at you, or trying to get away from somebody who's shooting at you. So you die.
Yeah.
You tend to die a lot very early on in that game, but it's great fun once you get into it. Just trying to keep your character alive is hard without other people shooting at you.
Did you say that one didn't work so much on Linux though, DayZ? Or
certainly DayZ standalone, and certainly the Arma 2 version of DayZ, which was basically a 2006 game, Arma 2, and somebody wrote a patch for it that's freely available. And you need DayZ, you need the Arma 2, you need Arma 2 Operation Arrowhead as a minimum for the patch to run. And it's a very good game. And DayZ standalone is very much the modern equivalent. The graphics in it are absolutely stunning, but because of the DRM, though you can run a DayZ server of either version in Linux, you can't play the game in Linux because DRM prevents it, which is really frustrating.
Yeah, I could imagine.
Okay. Any other questions, or is that it? Okay, John, back over to you, I guess.